It's been a while since I've done a code review on the channel. And the one that I have for you today is really interesting because although the developer had the right intentions and there are some things that are right in this code, it does fall short in some very interesting ways, especially when it comes to authentication and how to handle the server and client boundary. You're going to see that as we go through this code, it's going to become apparent that the developer has misunderstood how to actually work properly with the server and client boundary in React. Right now we have modern React. We can also write React code on the server, but it's very easy to misunderstand how to actually do it properly. And this is something that a lot of developers actually struggle with. And so with this project, we're going to see firsthand some of the struggles with the client server boundary. And we're also going to learn how to overcome them and how to actually use it properly, all in the name of becoming a better React developer. And speaking of becoming a better React developer, if you haven't checked out Import React, which is my newsletter all about React, which by the way is completely free, you should definitely check it out because on top of the usual articles and cool content about React delivered to your inbox every single week, I'm also going to be launching there a very special project that I've been working on behind the scenes for the past couple of months. This project is completely new and completely different from anything else that is out there. It doesn't fit into your typical categories of a course, a bootcamp, or tutorial. And I genuinely believe that this is going to be the future of how you and every single developer is going to learn React. And the best place to be the first one to hear about it is going to be the Import React newsletter. You're going to find a link for it in the description down below. Now, let's get into the code review. All right, so let's begin. So let's look at some code. So this is going to be the repository that we're going to be looking at for this video. I will leave a link to this repository in the description. You can actually check it out yourself. We will not, however, be running this application because honestly, there's no need to. We're only going to be focusing on the code, and trust me, that is going to be enough. Fun fact, apparently this code is written by a 13-year-old developer, and this was written for a competition in their local country. So keep that in mind as we review this code. All right, so now I have the project open up here on my editor, and let's see what this code is all about. Now, disclaimer, I did glance around at this code base a little bit before filming this video, so I kind of know where I want to go and what I want to focus on. I want to come here inside of the SRC, go inside of app. This is a Next.js application, by the way. And here I want to find the posts folder. This is going to contain all of the feature related to posts. Now, the reason why I chose posts instead of anything else, if you were wondering, is actually very personal. I just have a lot of experience with social media applications. So if I see something like this in a project, I'll tend to go with it. For me, it serves as a good entryway to the rest of the application. And it was right because I did find some very interesting things as soon as I opened this page here, which is the main page of the posts. So this being a Next.js application, the first thing that I want to focus on and to set straight is that this is going to be a server component that is going to run in the server. It's important to mention this because, again, as I said in the introduction, it's very easy to misunderstand the server and the client boundary and how to use them effectively. And the first step to using them effectively is to recognize them when you see them. So because here at the top, we have no use client directive, this is running on the server. So all of this code here will get executed on the server, and then the resulting HTML will get streamed and sent to the client. And this is important because, as you're going to see, we are doing some things on the server, which is correct, but then we're doing some things on the client, which is incorrect, and we're misusing the server client boundary, especially when it comes to this protected root over here, which is why the title of this video is related to authentication, because this is one of the biggest inefficiencies and problems in the code. But we're not going to start with that. Let's first start with this post component and see what it does. So here we have at the top, we export some metadata, right? This is the title, the description, and the SEO keywords, right? This is in some language. Maybe it's Croatian, if I believe, but I might be wrong. Let me know in the comments down below. Again, this is written by somebody that claims to be 13 years old for a competition in their own language. That's what we're seeing here. Then we have this export const revalidate, which we're set to 0, which basically makes it so that Next.js will not cache this page at all and will always request it on demand. Whenever a user goes to this page, they'll always get a fresh set of data, which is going to include these posts over here that we're fetching. And then we have the main component here. So this is the page component that runs again on the server. This is the post component, and this is supposed to be responsible for showing and rendering everything that is related to posts, including fetching the data to be able to show all of these things, which of course it does here, right? So here we have const fetched posts, and we're awaiting the get posts function, right? Because this runs on the server, we can have an asynchronous component and we can directly fetch data inside of it, and we can just await the data. This is fine so far. And then let's quickly go into this getPost function and just look at the code, because there are some things to mention, nothing really major, but still some interesting little things. So first of all, what I do like is the fact that this function is reusable and exported, right? Which means that anywhere in the project that we want to fetch the post, we can just use this function and not have to repeat ourselves over and over again. This is really good. However, one thing that I noticed that could be improved is this return type over here. If you see here, we're returning a promise because this is an asynchronous function that has the parsed variable here, the parsed key, which is going to be posts, which I believe is an array of posts. Yeah, so it's an array of posts. And then we have the response, the status code, and the success. These are all properties that I assume get used in the UI to show or do different things. Now, this is fine if you were doing this only once, but if you scroll down here, in this post utils, we have a bunch of other functions that do similar things. They make fetch requests and they all return a very similar response, right? We have here parsed, this is type of known, and then the same response, status code, and success boolean. And if you scroll on here, we're doing the same thing for create posts, and I can only assume that we're doing this across the entire project. So although the developer had the right idea in creating this utils file and then all of these individual functions that can be exported, they could have went a little bit further and also created a reusable type for this to then apply to every single function to not have to repeat themselves. And here's actually a way that you could potentially improve this. Now, this is in my own secret project that I talked about in the introduction. What I have here is I have a result type, which is a type generic. It takes type T. It's going to have success true. This is a hard-coded true boolean. And then the data that is going to be of type T, whatever type T that is. And then I even went further and I have this custom error type, which has the error here, which is going to get defaulted to a string, and then success false, and then the error E. And then what I'm doing is I'm exporting this action for every single one of my actions and potentially any queries, but I currently am not using any. And this is then going to take T and E and is going to return a promise of either result T or error E, right? So the promise is either going to be successful or it's going to fail, and I'm going to return either one of these results, right? This makes it super simple. I don't have to repeat myself. I can just apply it anywhere that I want, and it's a super clean API to just use in the entire project. And if you look here, this is one example of how I'm using it. So this is the function, the custom server action that users are going to use to submit a lesson when they have it completed. It takes in the lesson ID, and then it returns this action custom type here with the return value of a submission. That's your lesson submission, and then the XP entry, because you are going to be gaining experience as you do it. And then as I go through the code, I'm doing various different things. I'm checking authentication and stuff like that. And then at any step where I need to do something or exit the function, I'm then going to return this type. In this case, if we have an error, so if you're not authenticated, I'm going to return success false, and then the error unauthorized. Then I go on. If there's a lesson error, I return an error. And finally, at the end, after everything is done, then we're going to return success true, and then the data is going to be result. This is all type safe, and it's a very clean API that, as you can see here, I can just reuse anywhere that I want to have any single action. All right, now we're back in the project that we're reviewing, and we can actually close this file because we pretty much talked about everything that I wanted to talk about, and we now know how to improve this. So let's close this and let's look at the component and see what else it's doing. Here we have this post variable, which is checking fetched post.success, and if that is true, then we're going to set it to the parsed post. Otherwise, we're going to set it to an empty array. So regardless of what happens, we're always going to have an array of some sort, which means that we can come here and we can proceed to sorting the array. Now, this is fine. This is a simple sort, right? And it's sorting by the created at, but I don't like this because you shouldn't have to sort inside of the component directly. This is something that you should sort at the database level, right? You shouldn't fetch all of your posts and then sort them in JavaScript. That's inefficient. You should just send the actual ordering that you want in your database and let the database sort it, because it's much more efficient at doing that than JavaScript. And looking at this kind of seems like the default sorting of the post generally across the application, because generally in a social media app, you want newest to oldest, right? So I would just put this directly at the database level as the default sorting, and only if some component or something wants to customize that, they can specify a different ordering. And then you would remove this and it would simplify this component. And then if you scroll down, we have over here the actual body of the component. So first of all, what I like is that this entire page is rendered in 3 lines of code. This is really good. I love to see this. It's a sign of good design, right? We didn't clutter this post page with everything that is related to post and all the components all in one file. We've instead created this post page component, which, as you're going to see, has other subcomponents, and that's how we're composing the application. I really like this. This post page is wrapped in this protected root component, which has some very interesting things and mistakes when it comes to client and server boundaries. But to get to that, we first have to look at the post page and see what's actually here, because even here we made some mistakes with the client boundary. So this is a client component. So now we've crossed over into the client boundary. And this is really important to know, because after this point, anything further along in this file and everything that it imports, including all of these imports over here, are now always going to be in the client environment, even if some of these are server environment, server components. I haven't checked if anything is a server component, but even if they are, they would now be on the client environment because we are past this client boundary. That's what the use client directive here at the top does. It specifies a line, and after this line, you're now on the client. This is important. And then what we have here is we have our post page component. This one has a couple of state variables over here, the title and the description, and then some refs for the title input and the description input. This already is a little bit of a red flag, because I generally don't want to see state variables at such a high, big component level as this, right? The post page is the client component, at least how we are to understand it so far, that is supposed to render everything about the page. The fact that we put the state variable here means we have to put this use client directive here, which essentially forces everything to be on the client when I don't think that it should. I'm not sure yet. We're going to look at the code to figure it out, but already it's a little bit of a red flag. So let's see what we have. So here we have a main tag, we have a couple of divs, and then we have a couple of components here, right? So this is what I was talking about. I love this because now we have separate components, each are doing different things, and we can just plug and play them together like Lego pieces to build what it is, the actual post page. I really like this. Let's look at title input and let's see what this is. So title input takes the ref, the value, and the set value, the updater function for that value. If we look at this component here, this is a simple component that is wrapping the HTML input element and is just passing the set value and then the ref as well. We're using forward ref here because this project, I assume, isn't yet updated to React 19. If you're using React 19, you don't need to use forward ref anymore. You can just directly pass the ref. Now, here's the problem. And actually, there's a couple of problems here now that I think about it. The first one is that this is set to be a server component because it doesn't have the use client directive here at the top. So this actually shouldn't work by default. If you try to use this component in isolation, you're going to get an error. You're getting an error because you're specifying an on-change callback here, which is client only, yet you're inside of a server component because you have no use client at the top. Now, the reason why this is not throwing an error and why the developer did not catch it is because here we have use client. And as I said, this is a boundary, this is a line. So everything after this line, even if it is a server component like this one here, is automatically going to be on a client. So Next.js is not going to throw an error. But if you try to use this component directly inside of another component that was a server component, you would get an error because you can't do this. So that's the first problem. And the second problem is that this component is meant to be used inside of a form. It's not meant to be used directly individually in other components. Even if it's the only field inside of a form, it should still go inside of a form component. And the reason why you want to do that is because if you're using this individually, now you have to specify this title and description over here and the ref, and then you have to make the whole component a client component. This is by design because you're polluting this post page component, making it a client component just so that you can have this component work with the functionality that it accepts. Instead, a better approach is to take everything that is a form, because now that I see we have this title input and we have this description area, which I'm pretty sure does exactly the same thing, because why would it not? There you go. It uses the text area component and it does the same exact thing, is to take all of these components and put them inside of a form component, ideally using something like React Hook Form, and make that a client component and not this entire page, right? Something like this. If you're using Chat.cn, which you should, it's a great library. They have a lot of cool components. You can use it with React Hook Form, and they have components already pre-built. This is what this looks like. You have your form component. This one is going to be the client component because you do need client functionality to have an interactive form. And then you have your form field over here, which basically you're rendering the actual field. You don't need to manage any state variables, any refs. The actual form component and React Hook Form is going to do all of that for you automatically. This means that you can simplify this into one form component, call it the post form component, right? Or the create post form component, whatever you want to do it. And then you put that as a client component, and then then you get rid of all of these things here, and then you get rid of this use client, and now you make everything that should be on the server, not on the client. And this is what I mean when I say that it's super easy to misunderstand the server and client boundary and to make mistakes like this because it is not obvious, right? Especially if you're new to this and you're new to this whole modern React on the server thing. Let's then look at this style text container because again, it's doing very weird things. Like, why are we passing the description here to both description area and the style container? This is already a flag that these two components should directly go inside of the same component and just pass it once. You shouldn't have to pass multiple things to the same components, right? Create a wrapper component for all of the common reuse functionality. But let's look at the style container and see what this is. So this looks to be a style text container, which takes all of these props over here, and then on key down of the control key, we're going to look in this buttons array here to find, and we're going to call button.action. And then we're going to map over every single button here and do that. Let's see what this buttons array is. Is it defined here? It is. Oh, I know what this is. Oh, wow. This is okay. Do you know what this is? This is actually impressive, to be fair. Like, I didn't expect this. So these buttons here are essentially your rich text, right? So you can have a button for the bold, you can have a button for italic, you can have a button for underline, and all of these will call this action, which is going to, what does this do? Underline selected text from input. Let's see. Oh man, this developer went overboard. They essentially created a custom, okay, I have to give props for this, props for effort. They essentially created a custom rich text editor, which literally has the individual functions to edit the text and make it rich, to bold things, to create a hyperlink, and to do that. And the way that it's doing it, now I know why it's using the refs, is to actually go into the input ref and then get the actual selection start, selection end, and then manually do substitution, and then do this like weird wait for paint thing, just to like update the actual text area with the rich text editor. This is, although I wouldn't do this in an application, and I don't recommend that you do this, this is actually a great effort because they literally went for every single, my God, look at these. This is like, it's converting this to markdown, right? So like bold it and then bold and then the italics, right? This is all markdown. They just did this manually. You don't have to do this. There's actual solutions that I've done this already. One of the great ones is called TipTap, and they have a React component, right, which basically gives you all of this. So this is essentially the same thing that this developer did, just like automatically done for you. We can put all of this bold, italic, strike, right, and it does all of this for you. You don't have to implement this yourself. And the way that it looks, it's actually quite simpler, definitely, than what this developer did than implementing it yourself, right? So try to use something like this, especially for like rich text editors. That is not something that you generally want to do and implement yourself. Cool. And finally, we can now get to the thing that you've all been waiting for, the whole point of this video, and this is the protected root component. So let's open this component and let's see what we have. So the first thing to note is that this is a client component. So here again, we've now established a client boundary, and everything past that point, including all of these imports here, are going to be done on the client, and we're no longer on the server. Now this component here is your typical component that is supposed to check if a root is supposed to be accessed by a user that is not logged in, or maybe doesn't have the correct permissions. And then if it's not, it is just going to redirect the user to some other page, like the login page, for example. Right, so here we have the router. We have a state here for the is authorized or set is authorized, which null indicates loading. Sure. Then we're using this custom use auth hook, which we're going to look at in just a second. And then we're doing all of this in your beloved use effect. All of this use effect over here, right? Which basically, to summarize, is checking if the token is valid by making a fetch request. That's important. Then if we're not valid, then we're going to log out, redirect based on these conditions and stuff like that. And then we're doing this weird thing here where this handle redirect function is actually going to router.push and set is authorized to false. Essentially, we're now having client state to dictate whether or not the user is authenticated or not. Now let's look at this use auth here for a second, and let's just see what this is. So first, when I looked at this, I thought that this was doing some sort of mock authentication, like just storing a random user ID, right, just for demo purposes, not really implementing a proper auth system. But then I realized it's not. It has an actual backend with like seemingly proper authentication. Now the problem here is that it's storing all of these things in local storage, which you really shouldn't do, right? The local storage is accessible by JavaScript, so anybody can actually access this and set or modify the local storage. and it's especially bad if your is logged in boolean is dependent on this username here, which is coming and being set from the actual local storage. You don't want to do this. The best that you want to do is you want to store the access token of the user inside of state in React, not inside of the local storage, and then continuously refresh that access token every single time that it becomes invalid. Now, if you're curious about how to do all of that, I actually have videos explaining this and going into great detail as to how to do it, right? But you shouldn't have to do this. But we're not focused on the auth context because this is pretty typical outside of the local storage here. You want to store for your client components because some components are going to be client components and they need to know about the user's authentication state. You want to store the actual, ideally, the user object that is currently logged in, and then perhaps the access token if you need to send that manually as the headers in any request that you make. So this is typically fine, and then you just export that using use auth, right? That's fine. We're not focused on that. We're focused on this. Now, I hope that you can kind of see the error here, the fundamental misunderstanding of the server and the client environment. And if you don't, that's fine. Again, these things are hard to understand, and it's a completely different mental model that you have to adapt and learn. And unfortunately, that's just the way that it is in modern React nowadays, at least if you're using Next.js. So let's go back here to this page, right? The page that started it all. Remember that this is a server component. We have no use client here at the top. Here, we're fetching some posts, right? So before this component can actually render the actual posts, we have to get them inside of this. Now, all of this runs on the server, so we're not actually, I think we are making a separate request, but we're not actually loading any JavaScript to actually get that working. All of this is running on the server at the same time that we request the actual page. So this is the fastest that we can actually get our data because there's no JavaScript involved on the client, and we just directly get the rendered HTML alongside all of our React application, right? Problem here is that this protected root component is a client component. And the way that Next.js works is that first it is going to render everything that is on the server, and then it is going to stream in the client stuff as the client stuff gets ready. This way, you immediately get something on the screen, something that doesn't need interactive JavaScript to actually run. And then when the JavaScript gets loaded and the bundle gets actually populated, then your components mount and everything that is client gets streamed in at a later point, right? This is how Next.js works, and it's actually very performant. Now, the problem here is that we have this page component that is getting the posts on the server, but our actual authentication, determining if we're authenticated or not, and the redirect involved is happening on the client. It's happening after this entire server component has ran and returned the data. Only then do we actually stream in this protected root component, which is on the client. We get all the JavaScript needed to actually render the React application, mount this component, and only then are we rendering and calling this use effect here to check for the user and if they are authenticated. And this has multiple problems. The first one is that these posts over here get fetched before we actually check if we are authenticated, which I assume is not something that we want, because otherwise, why would we protect this root in the first place, right? We're protecting this root because we don't want the user, an unauthenticated user, to actually see the posts. But the posts are actually there and they're loaded and they're even rendered on the page before this entire protected root component runs, before we check anything. So this completely defeats the purpose, right? So that's a huge security flaw. The second thing is that it's hugely inefficient, right? We're checking all of these things here. And by the way, checking if the token is valid is another fetch request. So this is also going to take some time. It's going to take a few milliseconds at best, right? So not only are we waiting for this entire JavaScript bundle to load, for this entire component to mount, which again, after all the posts are fetched, but then we're then triggering this fetch over here. And look at this. We are, until we have the actual results. So here, if is authorized is equal to null, so we're hiding the content while loading, which remember, this null here indicates loading. Even if we have the posts, we're just not returning the children, we're just not rendering them until this fetch request is actually happening. This is hugely inefficient. We're doing this in the worst possible way. And the reason why the developer is doing this is because they have fundamentally misunderstood how to work with the server and the client environment, right? They completely misunderstood this. And again, it's easy to get to this point. It's easy to misunderstand this. And then they made the worst possible solution that has a security vulnerability and is also the most efficient way that you could have implemented authentication, right? So this is definitely not the way to do things. The actual way and the correct way to do things is, because this is running on the server, before fetching the post, run your authentication checks on the server directly in this component. You can do that, and you should do that. So something like, for example, const user equals await get user, some random function, which again is not part of this project. You await the getting of the user, and then if you don't have a user, you're going to return something user not found. This way, you're actually not even going to fetch the posts if you don't have a user, which again protects you from the security vulnerability if that's what you want. And then you no longer need to have any of these protected root over here, because if you don't want to just run the user not found, you can just return something, or even just call it redirect, and then just redirect from login. This is a function directly available from Next Navigation that can run directly on the server. You can just redirect to the login page if you don't have a user, and then this code never gets executed. So actually, you don't need this protected root component, and you can do all of this on the server and save yourself the headache. And actually, here's a very real example of how I'm doing it in my new secret project. So here I have this auth provider wrapper component. This is a server component, right? So we're not running on the client. Here I'm getting the user and the profile. The reason I'm getting the profile is because generally when you want to access the user, you want to access the profile as well. The profile is stored as an actual record in the database, and it's useful for me across the entire application. Then I have a check here. If we don't have a user or we don't have a profile, then I'm just going to early return this auth provider over here, and I'm going to set user and profile to null. We'll get to this in just a moment. Otherwise, if I do have a profile, then I get your subscription. I check if there's an error. If there's an error, I just throw and don't render anything. And then I render this auth provider here, and I pass it the profile and then the actual profile subscription and the user as well. This get current user with profile, I use it in any page where I need to have the user, like for example, the billing page. You should not be able to access your billing page if you don't currently have a user, if you're not signed in. So if I don't have a user, I'm just going to return null. Maybe I can just redirect, right? This is still work in progress, but you get the idea. Only after that do I fetch the subscription, and then do I render everything else, right? This is simple, and I do this in every single one of my pages where I need to do something and check for the user. And then this auth provider here, this is also really useful because, as I said, you also need sometimes to have access to the current user inside of client components, right? Not every component in your application is going to be a client component, and this is what this auth provider is for. Now, in my specific use case, I'm doing some interesting things here where I'm actually going to sign you in anonymously if you're not signed in, just because my code, my platform always assumes that there is some profile available. Even if you're not signed in, you're going to have a profile that is anonymous. And so that's what this code is doing. This code over here is just syncing your profile with my analytics provider. So again, not important. And here, if we don't have a profile, I'm just going to show a spitter for the entire application. This only gets run if I'm currently creating an anonymous user. This does not get run if we don't have a user, because again, this is being fetched beforehand. The fetching is done outside of the client component. And then what I'm doing is I'm just providing the profile and the user to the rest of my application with use auth. But as you can see here, I'm not even using it anywhere, right? That's how this thing should be. Most of your components are going to be server components, and there's very few cases where you actually want to have client components. But if I do, I have this use auth custom hook. I can use in any client component, and I can just directly access the profile and the user client side if for some reason I can't do it with a server component here, right? So really understanding the server and client boundary is super, super important. If you're working with server components, if you're working in Next.js, you have to understand this, because if you don't, you're going to introduce security vulnerabilities, and you are really going to hurt your performance a lot. So there you go. I think that's where I'm going to stop this code review. I pretty much talked about everything that I wanted to talk about, and I hope that now you understand a little bit better this client and server boundary, and you've now seen some actual real life examples of how you should actually do the thing, right? How you should actually structure your components that have both server and client components. If you want to check out this repository for yourself and dig a little bit deeper, feel free to do so. There's going to be a link in the description. Be nice to the developer. Remember, they said that they were 13 years old. So again, this is really impressive. They built out a whole like rich text editor from scratch. So again, be nice, no hate, all supportive, and all to make us better React developers, which is the whole point of my channel and the whole point of why I made this video. So that's it from me. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a big thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe. It really does help out the channel a lot. My name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.